Africa has stories that history books sometimes forget. Stories carried not by newspapers, but by grandparents, by elders sitting beneath trees, by families gathered after sunset, and sometimes by people who swear they saw something they could never explain. In Western Kenya, there is a story about an old woman who seemed to appear from nowhere. She walked through villages. She appeared in marketplaces. She spoke to ordinary people. And according to those who later told her story, she carried a message. A message about God. A message about Mary. And a message about someone who was coming. But there was something strange about this woman. People could not easily explain where she came from. She did not seem to belong to any ordinary family. She traveled from place to place. Yet her past remained a mystery. And as the years passed, the stories surrounding her became increasingly extraordinary. Some would eventually identify her as Mama Maria, and within Legio Maria tradition as an African manifestation of the Virgin Mary. But before there was a church, before there was a movement, before there was a man called Simeon Ondeto, there was the woman. So tonight, we go back to the beginning. Who was she? Where did she come from? And most importantly, what was she warning people about? To understand why her story became so powerful, we must first understand the world she entered. Western Kenya was changing. Christian missionaries had established churches and missions. Catholic catechists traveled between communities. The Bible was being translated and taught. New forms of worship were appearing. But Christianity was entering a society that already possessed its own traditions, its own understanding of the spiritual world, and its own stories about mysterious visitors, healers, and supernatural beings. For many people, the Christian message was not simply replacing an older world. It was becoming mixed with the questions, fears, hopes, and traditions they already carried. And somewhere within this changing world, stories began to circulate about a mysterious woman. She was not introduced like a missionary. She did not arrive with an official church delegation. According to later Legio Maria accounts, she simply appeared. And she began speaking. Her message would eventually become connected to one of the most extraordinary religious movements to emerge in Kenya. The exact beginning of the story is difficult to establish. Different accounts give different dates. Some traditions place the mysterious appearances as early as the 1930s. Other accounts place important encounters later. That uncertainty is part of the mystery. What remains consistent in Legio Maria tradition is the image of a mysterious African woman appearing among the Luo people. She was described as elderly. She traveled. She spoke about spiritual matters. And gradually, people began to attach a deeper meaning to her presence. One early tradition tells of an encounter at a Wendo market. A woman appeared there, and a tailor named Omolo reportedly gave her a dress. According to the story, the woman promised him an enduring name among the Luo. It is impossible today to independently verify every detail of this account. But the story survived. And stories survive for a reason. They tell us what communities remembered, what they valued, and what they believed was important. The woman was no longer simply a stranger. She was becoming a sign. What made this woman different? According to Legio Maria tradition, it was not simply where she went. It was what people believed happened around her. Stories attributed unusual spiritual power to her. Some followers later described healing. Others spoke of visions. Some claimed that she appeared in spiritual experiences. And perhaps most importantly, she was said to speak about the future. Prophecy. Warnings. Promises. A coming spiritual transformation. For the people who believed these stories, the woman was not merely wandering through Western Kenya. She was preparing people. Preparing them for something But preparing them for what? This is where her story becomes connected to another story. One that began thousands of kilometers away. In Fatima, Portugal. In 1917. 3 children in Fatima, Portugal reported visions of the Virgin Mary. The events became known as the apparitions of Fatima. The children were said to have received 3 secrets. The first 2 were later made public. The third became the subject of intense speculation. The Catholic Church eventually published what it identified as the third secret in the year 2000. But long before that publication, a different interpretation began circulating within Legio Maria tradition. Followers came to believe that the real meaning of Fatima had been hidden. And according to this interpretation, the message contained something connected to Africa. A coming revelation, a new spiritual mission, and a figure who would emerge in Africa. This belief is central to the Legio Maria understanding of its own origins. But it is important to say clearly, this is a belief within Legio Maria tradition. It is not the official interpretation of the Catholic Church. For the purposes of our story, that distinction matters. Because somewhere between Fatima, African oral tradition, and the mysterious woman, a new story was beginning to form. The woman was said to carry a message. Not simply believe, but prepare. According to Legio Maria tradition, she spoke about the coming of her spiritual son, a figure who would appear in Africa, a figure who would change the religious landscape. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. Because years before Legio Maria officially emerged, people were already telling stories about a woman preparing the way. Imagine living in a rural Kenyan community during that era. There are no smartphones, no social media, no television in every home. Information travels by people, by foot, by conversation, by church gatherings, by markets. One person tells another. One village tells another. And a story grows. The woman had become a messenger. But who exactly was she? Was she a wandering mystic? An elderly woman whose story grew with every retelling? A religious visionary? Or, as Legio Maria believers came to understand her, the Virgin Mary herself? Eventually, the woman became known as Mama Maria. But even here, the history becomes complicated. Different sources and traditions give different accounts of her identity. Some identify her as Regina Awich. Some traditions describe her as an African incarnation of the Virgin Mary. Other historical accounts treat the story as part of the religious mythology that developed around Legio Maria. And this is exactly why her story deserves careful telling. We do not need to tell you what to believe. We need to tell you what people believed. According to Legio Maria followers, Mama Maria was not simply an elderly woman. She was connected to Mary. She was connected to prophecy. And she was connected to the coming of a spiritual son. Her message was becoming clearer. Something, or someone, was coming. But every prophecy has a question. What exactly was being announced? According to later Legio Maria tradition, the woman was preparing people for the arrival of her spiritual son. The message was connected to Africa. It was connected to Christianity. And it challenged the idea that the most important religious events had to happen somewhere else. For generations, Africans had heard Christianity through foreign missionaries. Now, the story seemed to be saying something different. That Africa itself could become the stage of a great spiritual revelation. That God could speak through Africans. That an African religious movement could emerge from African soil. Whether one accepts the supernatural explanation or not, the cultural significance is enormous. Because this was not simply a story about a mysterious woman. It was a story about identity. Who gets to interpret Christianity? Who gets to speak for God? And can Christianity become fully African? The woman, according to the tradition, Was preparing people for an answer. Then came the waiting. Years passed. The woman continued to exist within the growing oral tradition. And the promise, the warning, the prophecy remained. Meanwhile, Christianity continued to grow across Kenya. Catholic missions expanded. Catechists taught in villages. Churches filled. But underneath the visible church structure, another religious imagination was developing. Some Africans were asking questions. Could Christianity be expressed differently? Could African traditions and Christian faith exist together? Could spiritual gifts such as prophecy and healing have a legitimate place within African Christianity? These questions were not unique to Legio Maria. Across Africa, independent churches were emerging. But in Western Kenya, one particular story was becoming increasingly powerful. The story of Mama Maria. And eventually, her story would collide with the story of another person. A young man. A catechist. A man whose life would become inseparable from the future of Legio Maria. His name was Simeon Melchior Ondeto. According to Legio Maria tradition, the mysterious woman was not waiting for just anyone. She was waiting for her spiritual son. And eventually, the story says, he appeared. Simeon Ondeto was a Catholic catechist. He was not yet the founder of the movement history would later associate with his name. He was simply a man working within the Christian world of his time. But stories about his life began to grow. And soon, people began connecting him to the mysterious woman. The two would eventually meet. And according to Legio Maria tradition, their meeting was not an ordinary meeting between two strangers. The woman called him her son. He called her mother. For those who witnessed the encounter, it became a moment of enormous spiritual significance. But what happened next? That is where our mystery becomes even deeper. According to accounts from within Legio Maria, the meeting between Mama Maria and Simeon Ondeto became one of the defining moments in the movement's early history. She called him her son. And he called her mother. For believers, this was confirmation. Confirmation that the mysterious woman had finally found the person she had been preparing people for. But for historians, the encounter raises different questions. When exactly did they meet? Where did the meeting happen? What did they actually say? And how much of the story developed through later retelling? Those questions remain difficult. But something is certain. The story of Mama Maria and Simeon Ondeto became central to Legio Maria's identity. And soon, the movement would begin taking shape. The mysterious woman was no longer simply a woman appearing in stories. She had become part of the foundation of a new religious movement. And the man she called her son was about to become its most important figure. And just as the story of Mama Maria was becoming larger, her physical presence was becoming smaller. The woman who had reportedly traveled through villages. The woman whose identity had puzzled people. The woman whom followers regarded as Mary would eventually disappear from the everyday world. Legio Maria tradition says that Mama Maria died in 1966. But her story did not die. Her name remained. Her image remained. Her prophecies remained. And most importantly, her connection to Simeon Ondeto remained. The mysterious woman had become part of the mythology, the theology, and the identity of Legio Maria. But there was still one unanswered question. If she had been preparing people, what exactly had she been preparing them for? So, who was the woman who came from nowhere? Was she simply an elderly woman whose story became larger with every generation? Was she a mystic? A visionary? A symbol created from the meeting of African tradition and Christianity? Or, as Legio Maria believers continue to proclaim, was she truly Mama Maria? The Virgin Mary appearing in African form? We may never be able to answer every question. But one thing is certain. Her story did not end with her. Because the woman had been pointing towards someone. Someone she called her son. A man who was already walking through Western Kenya. A man who had been a Catholic catechist. A man whose followers would eventually give him a name that would shock the religious establishment. Simeon Melchior Ondeto. Who was this man? Why did some people believe he was the one Mama Maria had been warning them about? And what happened when thousands gathered and claimed that something supernatural had been revealed? That is where the story gets even stranger. In episode 2, The Catechist Who Became Messiah. This is AfriTales, where Africa's forgotten stories awaken, where mighty kingdoms rise again, where fearless warriors, ancient mysteries, and timeless legends come alive. Every story is a journey. Every legend has a voice. Every tale is part of Africa's legacy. If you're passionate about history, culture, mystery, and unforgettable storytelling, you've found your home. Movie Camera, like, share and subscribe to @AfriTales_ku and join us as we bring Africa's greatest stories back to life. AfriTales, where history lives forever.